Thanks, Will. That's really very good explanations. Learning quite a lot today, actually. And item 11 is we move on to the Stormwater and Land Drainage Bylaw. Oh, and Lee in second. No, you can second. Right. Do you just want to give us a rundown on the main changes and additions?
Sure. So the key change being introduced through this new bylaw, all of the key changes really relate back to the new stormwater discharge consent, and the biggest one really is the introduction of a industrial stormwater discharge licence. So this will apply to industrial premises where the activities that they're undertaking have potential to contaminate stormwater. So these premises will be required to apply for a licence for their stormwater discharge, and they'll pay an annual risk-based fee, and they'll be subject to conditions and monitoring for their discharge. So the fees that we're proposing for this, that is purely to cover the monitoring and associated admin with that system. So that is linked to condition 47 of the stormwater consent, which requires council to maintain a database of all industrial premises, understand what risk they pose, and then there are a certain number that we need to audit each year. Another one of the key changes is in relation to erosion and sediment control from development sites. Now the bylaw is actually just a small part of a wider change with that. So primarily erosion and sediment control requirements will be managed under either resource consent or building consent, and where the bylaw comes in is where neither of those consents are required, and the bylaw simply says that the person doing development work will be required to prepare an erosion and sediment control plan and put measures in place to stop sediment running into the stormwater network. Some of the other key changes, there are some strengthened provisions around what's not allowed to be disposed of through the stormwater network. So a lot of that is around spills. There are some just tidying up of clearer maintenance requirements. So if you've got private devices, being very clear that they need to be maintained and working as they are intended to be. And there's also some more explicit protections of stop banks you might notice in there. Now that's not necessarily new protections because it was covered in the existing bylaw, but we're just making it very clear that it's covered, given there's been so much work in recent years on those. So happy to take questions.
Right, just when you talked about the sediment control, so we've got properties on the hills, obviously, when they're being constructed, they're very vulnerable to sediment going into the rivers. What about on the flat when you see buildings being constructed and they often use those filters out on the gutter? Is that part of their building consent?
Yeah, so that's an example of erosion and sediment control measures that they can put in. So it really just depends. If they have building and resource consent, it will come under one of those. So the bylaw is only really where those don't exist, and that's only for very small scale things. It could be for something like a demolition, which doesn't actually require a building consent.
Yeah, I'm just thinking of compliance. So when they do get a consent, does anyone go out and check? Because you still see sites that are not using those, and there's a terrible lot of sediment running down into the... And I know we encourage people to ring the pollution hotline, don't we, to Environment Canterbury?
Yes. Yeah.
Even though we're now monitoring that?
Yes, now with the checking, that's been part of some of the change, the wider change. Through the building consent process, there are now extra inspections as well before development starts. So that's been part of the wider change as well. And I don't know, Clive, I don't know if you have anything you want to add on.
Morning, Clive.
Kia ora. So there are steps when building consents are applied for. They have to provide, with the detail of the build, a adequate erosion sediment control plan, and have that detailed. And before any earthworks happen for the foundations, the inspectors will go out, our building inspectors will go to check that all the erosion sediment control measures are as of the plan. Then they can go and do the earthworks. Then there are inspections at every stage that the inspector goes out to sign off the build process. They will inspect to make sure that the erosion sediment control measures are still in place and working. If they're not, then they will be required to, before any further work goes on the building site, they have to be certain that the erosion sediment control measures have been brought up to standard before they can continue work.
Yeah.
And that's happening all the time.
So that's stricter in this new bylaw than it has been. Is that what you're saying, or has that always been the way?
The bylaw helps enforce where we don't have those controls through the Building Act and also through the resource management side of things.
Right. Thank you. Tim.
So how does it work between us and ECAN? Because prior to this, ECAN was the one responsible for monitoring and prosecution, if you like, and they were that kind of our team, our building inspectors, have picked that up because they were unable to enforce or to carry it out. So how does that work?
So if there are direct discharges into waterways, then ECAN is able to take enforcement action. If it's a situation where they're picking up, there are discharges coming out of our stormwater network, they can actually, they or the members of the public can lodge complaints to our call centre, and our call centre will then forward those complaints onto the various teams, whether it's to do with buildings or with earthworks or subdivisions. Then our staff go out and inspect and see what needs to be undertaken to stop those discharges. That's how we're operating at the moment.
And how does prosecution work? So, like, you turn up, there's obviously a breach in their plan. Mm-hmm. So, what's the stick rather than the carrot?
Well, the bylaw, we can, isn't it up to $20,000? Yeah. We can take legal proceedings against. That is not the most effective approach. It's a behaviour change approach with the industry as a whole. Yeah. ECAN have run erosion sediment control workshops for the industry to improve the situation. Our building inspectors are always working with the industry to make sure that they are performing better. And it's not ideal for a building company to have to stop work and actually fix up their erosion sediment control measures because it's a cost to them to do that, and for a building inspector to go out again and to make sure that it's up to standard. They can be charged for a second inspection fee as well. So we're not in a process of undertaking a lot of, charging them for offences, etc.
Yeah. I mean, the whole idea, isn't it? The ideal is that it's done right at the start, and they seldom see us unless we're inspecting for something. Building inspection is they are scheduled. So, I mean, the whole idea is to stop sediment full stop, and hopefully everyone's working on it. Do we do surprise inspections? Because building inspectors are booked in, so it's very clear when they're coming.
So we don't do surprise visits, but under the sediment discharge management plan, we have a process where if there are certain rain events forecasted and we're putting this system in place, that our teams will be alerted that those likely weather events will happen. And we'll be asking our teams to actually make extra effort to go out and look at what we consider to be the high or medium risk sites for loss of sediment, etc., during those sort of rain events, and to be able to keep, they're the eyes out there inspecting and making sure that what's going on. We'd need more staff to be able to do that really well, but it does come down to a lot of the public, members of the public, actually lodging complaints and us then taking action.
And when you say our teams, is that the building inspectors?
Correct. And also our enforcement team around resource consents for earthworks and things like that.
Okay, so there is a special enforcement team with regards to the earth, runoff and sediment runoff and that type of thing, rather than aside from the building inspectors?
No, we don't have anyone dedicated for that. We would love to.
Yeah. Okay. I guess through you, Madam Chair, that's something to look at, the capability, of our, our staff, because our building inspectors, as we know, we're all under the whole area is under the pump because of the immense building that's going on, and we in this organisation we often get something coming through, and the last people that are considered are the actually enforcement team that have actually got to go out and then add it to their list, because everyone complains. But yes, I'd really like some information on that and how we're looking at that, because the whole idea is not to prosecute, it's to solve the problem before it happens.
So could we get a memo from you through that how much resource to be required should the council look at putting in specific enforcement officers or compliance officers specifically for sediment control?
We can do that. There was a discussion between our staff and ECAN staff around all this, and it was about joint warranting of staff, council staff, with having a licence under the RMA to be able to go out and do this work. So we've had some preliminary discussion and look at what it would cost and what would be needed.
Great. If you could
Yeah,
get
so
that
we
to us.
could update that.
So can I just ask, so ECAN still haven't warranted our staff with regards to something they couldn't do?
Correct, they haven't.
So that's insane.
There are legal implications with that,
Yes.
which
That's just, yeah. We've got a problem.
Well, actually,
and,
if you could put that in the memo as well, that would be really helpful.
it'd be really good to just get a
Because,
clear
I
idea.
mean, there's challenges, but doesn't mean they're not, manageable. We could find a way through. Because if we're going to be cleaning up our waterways, sediment's a crucial part of that.
Absolutely.
yeah.
As you know full well. Thanks, Tim. We'll follow
It's
that up.
ridiculous, thank you.
Mel?
Right. With the erosion and sediment control plan, and it's through a building consent or a resource consent, when is it decided which one it is written into, I guess? Because with the ones I've seen are in resource consents, but if there's no, like in the future, if we don't need resource consents for new builds and things like that, will it automatically be in the building consent? I know the bylaw will apply if it's not there at all, but how is it decided whether it's in a building or resource consent? Do you know? I guess that's ideal.
My response would be that if they've lodged a building consent, then clearly it's through our building inspectors once the works is just proceed. If it's just earthworks, then it's our resource consent enforcement team that would look at it
Okay.
and deal with it.
Right. Okay.
But one way or another,
Yeah.
it goes on the radar.
Yeah.
A question?
Yeah.
Phil?
Yeah, it worries me a bit that I know that when some people do a subdivision, he can look after all the sediment control, and if you don't play the game, the main thing is to stop. If you can keep all your sediment on site, and it's very easily when it's a flat section, if it rains, because you can have a sediment control system that works for 80 or 90% of the time, but if the heavens open up, it wouldn't matter what you had, you're going to have a disaster. But what I don't want to see is us employing lots of extra police, for argument's sake, to go out and try and look after something that I don't think is that bad, or is it worse than what I'm thinking as far as sediment goes? Have you got a lot of examples of how bad it is?
It is the core major contaminant that we believe that needs to be dealt with under the global stormwater discharge consent. It's the one that we have the greatest capacity to be able to control and to minimise in comparison to things like dissolved heavy metals like zinc and copper. Sediment is a real issue for us, especially on the hills, and our building inspectors are picking up a lot of situations where the control measures are not adequate. So it is a big issue. It's not just for Christchurch, it's nationwide, the sediment issue. It's just about working with the industry to realise that it is a problem.
So I like what I'm hearing when you say working with the industry, and I don't think we should worry about the rest of New Zealand. We've got enough problems of our own. But so, like way back in the day, you never used to have protective scaffolding around the outside of your roof, but now we do, or we have those nets underneath where the top plate's hooked on. So we're just encouraging people to start thinking a little bit more. And of course, you'll have good guys and bad guys, won't you?
Yep, and it's not just the building industry. It's ma and pa doing landscaping on their hillside property. They've killed off the grass, they've dug it up, and they're going to do different landscaping with it. Cover and so forth. That exposes soil to getting into our stormwater network. So it's about educating the wider public that this is an issue.
Okay, thank you.
So I guess it's fair to say that if we did adopt or employ more compliance officers, that would be built into a fee schedule for the developer or the builder or anyone doing the project. Would it be cost neutral? Or I suppose we could just look at how we could make it.
Can I respond?
Yes.
I just think for clarity, what we'll do is we'll look at this whole thing when we bring a member back to you, and we'll look at if we do need more resource,
Yes.
and that's big if, how that could be funded.
Great.
So rather than just trying to respond
I'll do it now. It's lovely. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yanni?
Couldn't we put it in something in the bylaw so we can actually require a cost recovery model like we've done with the other things?
I think with the bylaw, because the bylaw is providing that catch-all and is really going to be the reactive monitoring to it, it's probably not the appropriate place for it. It might be more a fee for what would happen through building or resource consent. But I think just because the bylaws component of it is really only that catch-all reactive part, it wouldn't fit there.
I'd prefer just to require a license full stop across the board and charge a fee and recover the costs like we've done with the previous bylaw that we just discussed. So, I guess I'm just concerned because I think this will be an area where people do make submissions. So I guess the key thing is to have flexibility in our draft that would enable us not to be told, oh, it's out of order, you have to go through a special consultative procedure if you want to add those sorts of things in, because I think like Tim and Mel have raised this concern, and I think the community have raised this concern repeatedly around sediment control.
Well, this is a
lack of
special
resource.
consultative procedure. This is the time.
Yeah.
So
One of the issues we have with the bylaw is the tools to actually enforce it aren't as good as what we have through the RMA or through building legislation, which is why they will be the primary mechanisms for the erosion sediment control enforcement.
Right.
Yeah.
So if our building inspectors or enforcement team find the culprit and they're responsible for a discharge, then they will be charged an inspection fee. If it's like tracking sediment and material onto the road, if it's from a development and the developer gets a sweeper truck in to clear it up, that's great. But if they don't and we end up getting city care to do it, then we will charge the developer for the cost of cleaning up the road.
I understand that. I guess it was more having the ability to have proactive staff monitoring the sites before the sediment gets discharged so that we don't end up with the problem and fixing the problem.
Well, this is why we have these plans that are signed off by the building consents, for instance, and resource consent team.
Right.
So hopefully we don't have discharges, and then we have inspectors going out on a regular basis, and making sure that they're up to standard.
Okay. I look forward to the memo, but I am concerned that we don't have adequate resource in this field, and I would have
Well,
thought.
the resourcing is a different thing. Yeah. Yeah. Well, we're going to get the memo, and that'll be really helpful. Yeah.
That memo will also cover the timeline with regards to warranting, ECAN warranting our staff. Because it's no use having staff that aren't warranted. You can't prosecute.
Point. Yep. Great. Well, thank you. Are there any other questions on this one? So it's been moved and seconded. Is there any debate? No? Okay, and thank you for your work on this, and also just we have to recognise how incredibly complex our stormwater systems are. They're not part of our other infrastructure network, and the fact that they're in a state of requiring education of people to stop polluting them, to stop that contaminant at source is the key, which is what we're trying to do with the sediment control, and other volunteer groups are doing a heck of a lot to help us in that regard, aren't they? So thank you again for the work, Clive, that you're doing, particularly in that area. I'll put the motion. All those in favour say aye. Aye. Opposed? That's carried. Thank you.